Hello, welcome. My name is Linnea Anderson. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to Hybrid First Fridays, and welcome to both our in-person and online audience members. This season's theme is It Is All Fun and Games. We will investigate materials in the archives that are strictly recreational. Today's presentations will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel, so you should be able to access them within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you today to Alan and Bea from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentations. And if time allows, we will have questions and answers at the end, so please hold your questions until then. And if the Zoom audience members have any questions for our speaker today, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use Q&A and not chat so that we can keep track of your questions. In-person audience, please hang on to your questions until the end. There will be a tour after the presentation with Amanda, and you can meet her in front of the exhibit sign out by the main gallery exhibit. She's standing right back there right now. We recommend the tour. It's a lot of fun. So at this point, we will pause for a land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for Native American students, faculty, staff, and community. So our first presentation today is Dressed to Move, Women's Activewear, presented by Jean McKelvin, Goldstein Museum of Design. And during the 20th century, women increasingly participated in athletic games and recreational endeavors. And Dr. Jean McKelvin will show us how some of the Goldstein Museum of Design's garments tie into the broader history of women's activewear throughout the 20th century. Come on up, Jean.
Thank you so much, Linnea, for that nice introduction. For those of you who don't know, just briefly, the Goldstein Museum of Design is located in the College of Design with its primary gallery on the St. Paul campus. We have over 30,000 objects in our collection in areas related to apparel design, textiles, decorative arts, graphic design, and product design. We work quite a bit with classes in the university and outside the university, as well with the public and object-based learning. So today, within the overarching theme of games, we'll be looking more closely at garments used in athletic endeavors in the first half of the 20th century and how they relate to our collection. So this will include some mention of technological advancement and innovations in fiber development. As you know, we are so used to having these fibers available to us today, but they weren't always there. So in the United States, bathing was really a precursor to recreational swimming. Of course, those who lived by the water had always swum. That was not new, but not with the organization and kind of leisure of the late 19th and early 20th centuries into today, of course. So prior to the 1800s, personal hygiene and bathing was really not a priority for many. In fact, it was considered dangerous in the winter and excessive by others. As practice of regular bathing grew in popularity, large public bathhouses, like you see here, were developed in major cities. Bathhouses were often divided by gender, but people still wore things to the bathhouses, which forced the question of what it was they would be wearing. So a number of factors encourage people to bathe more and improve self and health through regular bathing. A 19th century focus on rationalism and scientific inquiry really led this charge and an understanding of germ theory. And, quite famously, John Snow, a British physician, came to map out cholera cases to discover that it was sourced back to water. And also armed conflicts like the Crimean War saw more soldiers die from disease than battle. So there's Florence Nightingale there, who was a nurse, but also a statistician, who carefully recorded death rates in military hospitals and found a link between sanitation and improved longevity. So things like this made bathing more regular. So as early as the 1860s and 70s, however, companies like Lord & Taylor and some fashion plates depicted people in a bathing costume, such as this, or such as these. And reports from medical professionals at the time encouraged exposure to the fresh air. If you think of, at this time, there was the Industrial Revolution. So in many urban areas, there was a lot of smog and grit, and they were encouraging people to get out. Also, in recent centuries, tan skin indicated something, a lack of refinement or hard labor, and it was becoming more acceptable to sport tan skin. So bathing suits like these were typically constructed from a woven fabric. Despite some more social acceptance of modern bathing suits, many went to the beach to enjoy breeze and air versus swimming in the water. But you can see even in the scene that there are a number of people both in regular everyday dress, while some are in bathing costumes. Now, as this was going on, industrial knitting was gaining some traction, and large-scale production of knit goods was really developing in the late 1800s. But it was initially developed primarily to create undergarments or stockings and hosiery. So the collection photo on the right, it's a little hard to make out because it's a cream union suit on a white mannequin. But this is typically, a use for machine knitting at this time. The Bradley Knitting Company of Wisconsin launched the first bathing suit in knit in 1905. A lot of these were originally focused on men. Now, in terms of fiber, just to briefly branch off into the technology, wool was the best material for swimwear at the time and athletic wear because it wicked moisture. We still hear that today from companies like Patagonia and, that are making the knit wool base layers. And part of what made them wick better was, of course, their structure. That helical structure wicked water much better than cotton, which is basically like a sponge and attracts water and really holds it inside. Another advantage to wool was it was slightly, not incredibly, but slightly more resilient than cotton. As any of us who've worn denim jeans know, they stretch out and they don't spring back right away because cotton has very poor resilience. So a lot of swimsuits were made of wool originally, but here, as I said, a lot of women still wore woven suits, which of course were clingy when they were wet. So this was largely due to modesty norms, due to the clinginess of a lot of that fabric. Now, men were expected to keep their chests covered on public beaches and have a skirt component to their suit that went down over their hips. But you can see women have like a turned collar suit that was really quite formal in some ways. Now, concurrently at this time, at the turn of the century, this type of ensemble was very popular. It was worn by women of all classes. It was worn by elites. It was worn by working women and women at university. So it was really quite a divergent kind of ensemble from what had been previous because it enabled this idea of separates. Prior to this, dresses were the same thing from neck to, to hem. And here you had a skirt that you could interchange with different blouses, which was quite liberating in many ways. And so it makes sense that it kind of became the model for athletic wear at the beginning of the 20th century. So here we see a woman or women playing field hockey. And they're wearing that kind of shirtwaist blouse, which there's one from our collection pictured on that slide. We have in our collection, I bet we have 100 of these. They were so ubiquitous and common. And then there's a woman with her bicycle wearing a similar ensemble off to the right. Cycling had become enormously popular in the last part of the 1800s. And a lot of women also really found this to be an amazing pastime, and it offered them a lot of new kind of freedom that they hadn't had before. Games like tennis were also increasingly popular at this time for women. More people had more leisure time. Yet there was really no model for athletic wear outside of mainstream dress. So the two garments from our collection that I showed here, they may not have been used in athletic endeavor, but they may have because they meet that silhouette. And if you'll notice, even though to our standards, it's not a short skirt, this is really a much shorter skirt than had been featured previously. It really means the feet and shoes are unencumbered by a lot of petticoats and a lot of swishery. So there's a lot more freedom with. There is, of course, this lore of the bicycling costume, and it did exist, but I would say it did not commonly exist or was not commonly worn. So it was far more common for women to wear standard dress at this time while bicycling. Bifurcated garments were still pretty controversial, even in athletics at this time. In the illustration on the right, you can see women depicted wearing both day dress and kind of that bicycle costume as they're tootling along on the Coney Island bicycle path. So as I mentioned, most women were still wearing woven suits, bathing suits like you see here, but a new paradigm began to emerge for the average girl, where a wool knit suit that likely took cues from men's swimwear and knit undergarments came into popularity. And notice how tight those buttons are along that suit. And of course, that's because it would gap and sag once it got wet. So you really wanted that to have a distinct closure. Take forever to do all those. And regardless of type of suit, if you were in a public beach, you might pair your suit with tights and shoes like you see here. But notice the drag on this wetsuit. I mean, it would be like wearing just a basic shirt. Of course, some women were interested in swimming as an athletic endeavor. Which led the charge, I imagine, for new suit typologies. And these were certainly worn outside social boundaries of acceptability. The photo on the left shows Australian swimmer Annette Kellerman, who is certainly wearing a corset and she's got her hair all done up. I'm sure it's for a promotional photo. She didn't swim like this. The one in the middle is much more in line with how she would have competed. And on the right, you can see this Olympic team from 1912, and they are wearing wool suits, which is the best, which is why it's being worn in the Olympics. But you can see how transparent it is when it gets wet and how much it sags. So it still is not what we would consider high performance wear. Now, calisthenics and golf and all of these kinds of sports were increasingly introduced to women in educational contexts. And wool gym ensembles like this one were typically issued as a uniform and seems to reference previous styles such as the bicycle costume. So you can see here that the ensemble is visibly bifurcated or pants, which, even 10 years ago was highly controversial, but now probably a little more acceptable in this milieu of athletics. By the 1920s, fashion mainstream silhouette had changed significantly. It was less confining. However, there was still little distinction between mainstream dress and athletic wear. Again, this object from our collection is not necessarily athletic wear, but the one that the woman is wearing is not necessarily athletic wear, who has the tennis racket. Norms for women's bathing suits changed pretty drastically, though, in the 20s, along with that drastic change in fashion. So even terminology began to change. Janssen is credited with being the first company to call it a swimsuit. Of course, it literally was a bathing suit for many years, but now it's actually being called swimwear. And swimming is becoming, increasingly popular. Also, if you think about it, there is, advancements in municipal water sources and indoor plumbing. So the necessity to bathe in public has really, gone by the wayside, not completely, but it's waning certainly. So there's this increasing leisure and recreation associated with swimming. Of course, vacationing and things like that also picked up at this time with the advancement of cars and that making people more mobile in general. So while the 20s saw a general loosening of fashion styles and modesty, there was also growing concern about fashion styles and modesty. And here you can see women having their hems measured to make sure their skirts comply with beach standards. And also, some of the suits were backless now so that women could tan without getting strap lines. So tanning creams became more popular. But men's suits, typical of menswear, it stayed the same for about, it's literally the same as it was, 25, 30 years prior, except they have moved on to like a tank versus like a t-shirt top. Wool was still used in the 30s, and there was not a lot of change. If you think of the 1912 Olympic ensembles, they're not that much different than what we're seeing in the 30s. However, recreational wear is getting much more scant. And there's a photograph of Jean Harlow kind of showing off in her swimsuit. During the war, swimming was an inexpensive pastime, usually just costing the price of a swimsuit. So 40s are interesting too, and that women started showing their midriff in swimsuits, which hadn't been done previously. And sometimes they were made in cotton and other materials. Oops. During World War II, development of synthetic fibers, of course, burgeoned. There were a lot of shortfalls in materials, especially natural fibers, a lot of needs for silk and wools for uniforms and parachutes. So nylon was developed by DuPont, and during the war, it was exclusively used for the war effort. But they began to apply it to new products like swimwear after the war. So swimsuits became more ornamental and had a tighter fit because nylon, of course, had much better resilience than any of the natural fibers. And Speedo produced their first nylon racing suit in 1956 for the Olympics. And you can see the fabric is getting increasingly resilient. But notice that on the microscopic fibers there, if you look at the ends, how different synthetic fiber is to the wool fiber. So you can imagine you can get a much tighter, closer knit with synthetic than you can typically with wool. While men had been prohibited from baring their chests in the early part of the 20th century, by 1950, it was completely common to have no shirt on while at the beach. And their suits really followed that shorts. In the US, it really followed that look of shorts with a range and tightness of fit. But spandex, which is an anagram of expands, was developed by DuPont again in the 50s and put into production in the 60s. So here you can see on your left, this 1976 Olympic team and how much tighter and more opaque those suits are, because you can really knit that stuff tight. And it became increasingly compressive over the next like 30 years, to a point where on the far right there, you have a suit developed that's so compressive and made out of such high-tech materials that it was banned because it was thought to give too much advantage to the people wearing it. It actually made it buoyant. But in public schools and gym classes, this was part of an average curriculum. This probably triggers some trauma for people. So, but a lot of girls wore pretty much the same kinds of things they wore every day to gym class. However, that changed relatively quickly. And that there were gym suits starting to be issued. Now, this gym suit is from the 70s, but the picture is probably from the 50s, but you can see how similar they are. So really that same style of gym suit had a long duration of use. You know, more recently, these are, of course, 40 years apart, but nevertheless, with some minor style changes, kids are kind of wearing the same kinds of things to gym class. Students are probably wearing things though that have more synthetic fiber, even if they look like cotton. Those kinds of things switch, but only due to, economy and what's widely available. So there's a big shift over the years related to social roles of women, technological advancement, and how we live our lives. And, the tech fibers that originally were incorporated into garments that dealt with water eventually made its way to kind of everyday wear. So even though there's very, high-end tech wear, a lot of young people wear it either as everyday wear or not to the quite same extent that you would for competition. But it's just an interesting evolution to see how much we've changed in both social mores and in technology. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was so interesting. Thank you. So our next presentation will be The Wide World of Impractical Sports, presented by Ryan Bean from the Couts Family YMCA Archives. Well, likely best known for creating basketball and volleyball, the YMCA has a long tradition of sports innovation, and this presentation explores the lighter side of wellness.
Thank you for that, Linnea. That was a great presentation. I guess now, as they say on Monty Python, it's time for something completely different. So as Linnea mentioned, my name is Ryan Bean, and I'm with the Couts Family YMCA Archives, where we work to collect, preserve, provide access, and interpret the rich history of the American Young Men's Christian Association. The American YMCA came to Boston in 1851 by way of London, and can now be found in over 10,000 communities serving roughly 13 million people annually. Today, I'll share with you from the perspective of the YMCA, the wide world of impractical sports, or really, is this supposed to be fun, get me fit, be physically possible? Over its long history, the YMCA has been many things to many people. The scope of the organization's interests are best captured for me by the YMCA logo, an equilateral triangle representing the holistic development of one's mind, body, and spirit. Today, I'm going to speak about the body side of that equation. Created by Luther Gulick in 1891, this logo is just one of many contributions of Luther Gulick to the YMCA and, by extension, the communities they serve. Born in Honolulu in 1865 of missionary parents, Gulick's contributions were, as I mentioned, many and varied, which we'll show during our time together, especially the varied bit. One of Gulick's more significant contributions was the merging of physical work with the YMCA's overall agenda of developing, quote, Christian personality. As demonstrated by the logo he created, Gulick sought unity and symmetry in his work. He articulated this through the lens of muscular Christianity, which was intended to be an antidote to the perceived effeminacy of Protestant Christianity of that time. In his book on the topic, historian Clifford Putney cited critics such as G. Stanley Hall, who contended that women's influence in the church had led to an overabundance of sentimental hymns, effeminate clergymen, and sickly sweet images of Jesus. These were things that were repellent to real men and boys, asserted critics, who argued that males would avoid church until feminized Protestantism gave way to muscular Christianity, which was a strenuous religion for the strenuous life. So what was going on here? For people like Gulick, physical fitness was a method for developing character, which was the core goal of the YMCA, and in particular, developing masculinity. Gulick must have been a force to be reckoned with, as he sought a host of avenues to promote his modern way of being. Quick bio on Gulick. He studied physical education at Oberlin College, and in 1886, he enrolled in medical school at the City University of New York, where he earned his MD in 1889. While pursuing his medical degree, Gulick also joined in 1887 the faculty of the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. Today, that school is known as Springfield College. The training school, which had opened 2 years prior, was created to train a new generation of YMCA workers and to develop and promote through the YMCA a new modern method of community development. He was with the training school until 1903, when he left to become the first director of physical education for the New York Public Schools. The following year, in 1904, he chaired the Physical Training Lecture Committee of the St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exhibition, or World's Fair. He was a member of the U.S. Olympic Committee, for both the Athens Games in 1906 and the London Games in 1908. He was a co-founder of the Boy Scouts of America and Campfire Girls, the latter of which he co-founded with his wife, Charlotte. He also published many books. A tragedy of his life is that despite his commitment to wellness, he suffered from poor health his entire life and died in 1918 at the age of 53 after returning from Europe to survey the work of the YMCA with the American Expeditionary Force fighting in the First World War. But rewinding a bit, let's take a look at one of the most enduring legacies of his promoting creativity in the YMCA, wellness and recreation. Here we see a picture of the first basketball team. James Naismith, who is credited with creating basketball while attending the YMCA Training Institute at Springfield, was given an assignment to create a game that could be both played indoors and promote group cohesion. The assignment was to address the perception that many competitive sports of the time overemphasized the individual. Think track and field type of sports. The goal was a game that de-emphasized the individual by encouraging teamwork, and in the process demonstrated the value of community cooperation in achieving a goal. Though still a team sport, when comparing early basketball to, say, the NBA of today, the two can look quite different. Amateurism and sport as a tool directed at a greater aim were core to the first version. In fact, it took several years to invent the hole in the basket, thus speeding up the game. Prior to that innovation, I guess, after achieving a basket, one lowered a lever by which the ball could be removed, retrieved, and put back into play. That more than anything tells me about the priorities that were at play here. Here, the goal is about achieving a collective task versus accumulating the highest score humanly possible. And I'm sure you figured it out that the individual who gave Naismith that assignment was Luther Gulick. While muscular Christianity was the frame through which much of this work was articulated, there were also worldly concerns fitness and recreation were meant to address. Though not exclusively, the YMCA is by and large an urban institution, and therefore centers much of its work on urban needs. The body side of the triangle was focused on addressing the decline in health one experiences from a sedentary lifestyle and an increased access to calories. Basketball is a perfect example of YMCA community development through programs and services. In this case, the Y combined their twin concerns for physical health and social cohesion to innovate something new. And speaking of the concerns for unhealthy living, volleyball is another YMCA sport innovation. Invented 4 years after basketball in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is just down the road from the YMCA training school at Springfield. Initially called Mintonet, volleyball was based off the game Mitten, which itself was an offshoot of badminton. William Morgan was inspired to create volleyball after learning of Mitten with YMCA missionary David McCogany brought back to Camp Gulick in Maine when he returned from India in 1895. Note the Gulick there. What niche was volleyball intended to serve, one might ask? Morgan's goal for volleyball was for it to be, quote, not so rough as basketball. It was intended to be a less demanding team sport for middle-aged businessmen, not unlike what you see here. After experimenting first with a basketball bladder, which in other words was the ball with the leather exterior removed, which proved too erratic, and then with full basketballs and soccer balls, Morgan wrote down the specifications for a ball somewhere in between, wrote to the Spalding Brothers Company of New York, who agreed to make the ball. The specifications Morgan came up with are by and large the same as the ones that govern the sport to this day. Though like basketball, the pace of volleyball has certainly increased, which makes me wonder if these guys played volleyball today, would they have the heart attacks the sport was intended to prevent? Beyond individual sports, the YMCA was also a space where ideas related to wellness could flourish. Here we see Robert Roberts, great name, the grandfather of YMCA physical fitness. Roberts became the first YMCA physical director when he was hired in 1876 by the Boston YMCA to manage its gymnasium. The first generation of YMCA gyms were very much modeled on the German Turner movement, which emphasized gymnastics. During his second year with the Boston Y, Roberts fell from a swing in the gymnasium. And while reflecting on his injuries, as injured people are wont to do, produced the mantra found on my opening slide. All exercise should be safe, easy, short, beneficial, and pleasing. Healed, Roberts returned to work and built a program based off of that mantra. Calisthenics, light gymnastics, marching, and health tips became emphasized. In other words, bodybuilding. A term which Roberts is credited with coining. Robert Roberts set the stage for Gulick's success by establishing a foundation of standard activities, which were quickly adopted by YMCAs at the time. With regards to Roberts, Gulick had this to say. Roberts was a rough block of granite, which, standing firmly at a critical point in the stream, directed it so thereafter it flowed in a new and permanent bed. I'll let you decide if that's meant as a compliment. Though Roberts and Gulick reportedly had an adversarial relationship, who apparently saw eye to eye on nothing. But for those successes, what other games and ways to get fit were produced under the YMCA's banner? Was every creation a hit? I'm sure you can tell by my sharing an image from one of my favorite childhood cartoons that some sports can be downright silly. For instance, there are games that would give lawyers nightmares or be a fantasy depending on their perspective. Camp seems to be a rich source of the dangerous side of fun. I'm assuming these are pugil sticks and not oars, though one can never be sure. While this is not from a specific Y camp, it is an advertisement in a Y publication. And as you'll see in my next slide, the advertisements for equipment paints an interesting picture of what could happen at a Y. The YMCA was part of a growing ecosystem of health and wellness providers, promoters, and equipment manufacturers, each informing the other. Morgan's working with the Spalding Company to create the volleyball, for example. Again, one for the lawyers, this ad from a publication is promoting the Jungle Gym, also produced by the Spalding Company. For the happy children, this Jungle Gym apparently has the capacity for 100 kids to play on at once. And as a parent of a 6-year-old, my concerns are certainly allayed by the inclusion of, quote, you see on the bottom there, many horizontal bars are always in reach of the hands and feet, making the Jungle Gym absolutely safe at all times. I guess with 100 children on this contraption, if you fell from the top, you'd have several dozen of your peers to cushion your fall. Though I would not want to be stuck at the bottom. Perhaps this jungle gym is a Darwinian metaphor for society. In addition to the YMCA training school, YMCA publications like the Journal of Physical Education were spaces where one could keep pace with the rapidly evolving world of fitness. Not every new idea had to come from the YMCA. They were happy to promote new ideas and wellness from many sources. For instance, this is an excerpt from a series of stretching and strengthening exercises promoted by Canadian physician Robert Tate McKenzie. Developed by Major Fred Barnum, these movements were to be done to music at waltz time. And here is a photo of it in action. In reading the instructions, one would go through a set of choreographed movements, each leading into the next. From the introduction, Dr. McKenzie shares how, quote, the form and number of the illustrations have been chosen so that each exercise may be read off like music by the figures alone. Stressing the importance of the illustrations and assumingly stressing the superiority of his, McKenzie writes, a poorly illustrated drill may be like a singed cat, better than it looks. But people don't want any singed cats now that they can be avoided. The color commentary and the instructions for many of these exercises is another thing I find so fun about these old exercises. My favorite I'll share in a bit. So with all these new forms and adaptations of old forms, just like how volleyball was an adaptation of mitten, which itself was modified from badminton, could perhaps the Barnum bar be the ancestor of the shake weight? Stretching was not limited to the Barnum bar movements. People have long sought a quick fix for that which ails them. Case in point, this torturous looking stretching technique, where upon being strapped in, dizziness may soon follow. However, as someone who suffers from back pain, though this looks silly and I appreciate the disclaimer, I might be talked into trying it if someone told me it did the trick. And speaking of silly, sometimes you come across an exercise that gives pause as to whether it is possible. Sometimes these exercises are presented in a way that makes me wonder if the authors took Dr. McKenzie's comments on the illustrations too much to heart and had more fun drawing the pictures than actually trying their creations. Speaking of pictures, I'm fond of this gem for some reason, maybe because it lets me reference an earlier slide. Though Roberts was injured performing acrobatics, they continued to be a regular feature at many YMCAs through to today. In fact, the YMCA continues to coordinate and host national gymnastic championships and invitationals, though I suspect routines have evolved from the crab seen here. And like how gymnastics continues within the Y to today, one reoccurring theme of YMCA sport and fitness is the use of a ball. And for every basketball, you have a cage ball. It's sort of basketball on steroids, I guess. You might be able to see the large net in the background. And in addition to cage ball, we have roller ball and push ball. Though the balls kept getting bigger, the common theme is moving the ball through teamwork into or over a goal. However, not to limit themselves, small balls were also deployed. Here, code ball or foot golf, not a YMCA invention, though popular with many Midwestern YMCAs in the 1930s, bucked the team sport trend. As far as I can tell, it was literally golf, but you kick the ball versus using a club. Like code ball, sometimes games are combined to make something new, like golf basketball, which is basically a formalized version of the perennial playground favorite pickup game of horse. Not only fun, but also it's not only fun, but amazing to see the variety of experimentation in health and wellness arena. YMCA professionals like Roberts and Gulick were a wellspring of innovation. But some innovations, frankly, can make this period of experimentation and adaptation look more like throwing spaghetti at the wall. For example, 10-minute exercises for busy men, which one could purchase for 10 cents or about $3 today. I wonder if Dr. McKinsey would think this a singed cat. So this exercise is my favorite, and in particular, the color commentary. So if you humor me, I'll read this. To be taken on rising, jump out of bed, strip. If the floor is cold, put on a pair of thick, warm stockings. First, arm circles, 10 times. Fill your lungs before each exercise. Elbows straight, circle 1 foot in diameter, 10 circles in 5 seconds. Rest a second. Repeat exercise. Rest, repeat. Keep on until you have repeated 5 times. Put lots of snap into your work. Breathe deep 5 seconds. Take in all the air you can. Let out all the air you can. This is followed by a stationary run. At the rate of 15 steps in 5 seconds, 1 minute, breathe deep, 10 seconds. You notice breathing is really critical to the success of this. All of that is followed by the twister. 10 times each way, 30 seconds. Keep your feet together. Don't bend your knees, bend your waist. Don't be afraid, it won't break. Get way down on each side. Breathe deep, 5 seconds. That's followed by the kneader. 30 times, 30 seconds. First one leg and then the other. Squeeze hard, work fast. The bigger your abdomen, the more you need this. Breathe deep, 5 seconds. Followed by the bender. Maybe you need this after a bender. 30 times, 30 seconds. Go way down. Come up straight, breathe deep, 5 seconds. And then another stationary run, this time with more description. 1.5 to 3 minutes this time. Begin and end slow. Run fast in the middle of the time. Lift your feet high. If constipated, run with your knees up in front at every step. Very helpful tip. Finally, take off your stockings, assuming the floor was cold when you woke up. Wring out a towel in cold water. Rub all over. Take your Turkish towel by both ends and rub hard. If you are chilly afterwards, the water was too cold. The cooler it is, the better if you're warm afterwards. Get dressed and go to breakfast. If you can take twice this exercise, it will be better. Commence gradually. Use long rests and few movements at first. If you don't, you will be lame. You can easily prove this. Take the same exercise just before going to bed. But don't hurry. If it keeps you awake, take it only in the morning. Exercise every day. If you don't, you cannot say that it was the failure. You are the failure. Keep it up while traveling. And note in the summary here, this is my favorite part of this. After all of that, 4 minutes and 50 seconds, nearly half of the 10-minute exercise is spent bathing. And the creator of this ingenious exercise hack was none other than Dr. Luther Gulick. Of all the wise innovations, could one of the greatest be the predecessor of 10-minute abs? Probably not. But in conclusion, beyond the hits of basketball and volleyball, these misadventures in wellness help to tease out an important dynamic, the difference between the tool and the intent. Just like basketball was designed to teach a group of people how to accomplish a collective goal, popular or not, silly or serious, this wide world of impractical sports highlight the ways that the YMCA, following Robert Roberts' advice, sought to improve lives by making exercise safe, easy, short, beneficial, and above all, pleasing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, we do have time for some questions. Let's start with the online Q&A. Alex, is there any question in there?
There are no questions, but there was one comment that someone had a recollection about falling off of the jungle gym when they were in kindergarten and breaking their nose.
I think some of us may have had experience with these jungle gyms in the past. So from the audience in the room, oh, I see a hand up over.
And I'll bring a mic over.
Thanks, Mike.
This is a comment, not a question, but growing up in California in the late 40s, we had a town natatorium. And if you forgot to bring your suit for swimming, they gave you one of those full body wool suits to wear during the swim. So most people really remembered their suits.
Any other, oh, there's a question over here.
I'll be
from
right
the
there.
Audience.
Hi, did laws have to get changed with all of the changes in costume that became more and more scant?
And I think this might be for you, Julie.
You know, there are, of course, new laws all the time, but they're usually not mandated by any state or federal government. It's usually more school related or location related, but certainly that still exists that we would have. I know there's a lot of student dress codes and people can be coded. They got written up, or, you know, so that certainly does happen over time.
So this is about those Janssen swimsuits. I remember as a child that adults would, there was a transition period, or maybe you can tell me if you think it's a transition period, where those Janssen suits had that panel across the front. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it seemed to me like that was sort of a modesty transition type of situation. And then it went to just completely foregoing that panel and going into the kind of suits we wear today. But that panel was always fascinating to me as a child, because I was wondering what exactly was a function of it, except for maybe transitional modesty or something like that. So if you could just tell me your opinion about that.
Sure. You know, I think that those skirted suits extended up well into the 50s and into the 60s. I mean, of course, some suits like that are sold today. And I do think it's a matter of modesty and stylistic preference more than anything else. I don't, there was no function to them other than to cover up the body more or less. But yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's interesting.
And then we'll check in to see if there's any questions from the online audience. No, okay, nothing from the online audience right now. So I think there was a question over there. Thank you.
Mine is a comment as well. For 10 years, I lived on various apartment buildings along the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. And there were a couple different baths that still existed back there as late as 1984, the Brighton Beach bath. And then there was another bath, I can't remember. But at that time, they were no longer used as baths. They were private pools at that time. So because the need for the baths was no longer there, but they kept the name bath. And you had to pay to get into those because swimming in the water there on Coney Island in those days, it was a pretty disgusting experience.
Sounds as though today's presentations have brought up a lot of memories for the audience, mostly good ones, I think. So are there any other questions either online or from our audience members in the room? Oh, one over there. Great. Thank you.
When I hear the term bathhouse, it suggests a place to get clean. In the early days, of course, people didn't have hot water in their apartments, maybe not even running water. I think as late as the 50s, there was a bathhouse of that kind on Riverside Avenue, 2 blocks from here. And when I lived in Boston's North End, the oldest part of town in the 60s, which was still a first and second generation Italian immigrant neighborhood at the time, there was still a municipal bathhouse with unlimited hot water, and it was free, of course. So that was still being used some at that time.
And then presenters, does either of you have a commentary or a follow-up on the information about the bathhouses? I know there were some slides in your. Yeah, if anyone would like to make a follow-up comment on reminiscing about bathhouses.
Only that's so interesting to me that those were still in use, and how integral they were with the social fabric, and needed they were. I'm curious to ask Ryan if there were any, how the YMCA, did they have bathhouses or anything associated with them?
Not not for bathing, though. Basically, it was the same thing, and it's actually pretty contrary to this whole conversation here. So the first indoor pool in the United States was built in the Brooklyn YMCA in the 1890s, and by the early 1900s, the pool became a pretty standard feature. However, the pool was just a glorified giant bathtub. There was no filtration. It was filled, and then they would use it, and after the course of a week, they would drain it, scrub, and do it again. But being the Young Men's Christian Association, it was broken up by gender, and the swimming was exclusively nude. And most YMCA's, it's a perennial question we get is, whatever happened to nude swimming at the Y? And they stressed it as the hygiene aspect, both in terms of normalizing body type, but also, this is just this, well, by the end of the week, cesspool. You want to be careful of what's entering it. So yeah, the hygiene aspect was really critical to the YMCA, but they forego all that, and they continued nude swimming well into filtration. And there were excuses that, well, with filters, the wool fibers will clog the filters, so that's why we need to keep it. And eventually it was sort of just called that as being sort of this legacy practice, that the reason, the motivation for it had long gone away, and now there's swimming, and co-ed had a lot to do with that.
It looks like there might be a question or comment from online.
There's one about how outfits are preserved by the museum, and similarly, if someone has something to donate, some piece of clothing, suggestions for where to do that.
So how are outfits preserved and donated? All right.
You can contact me. My name is online if you go to the Goldsteins website. And we do keep them as well as we can in climate controlled areas, and either boxed or hanging, depending on what we have space for. So we're certainly always looking at new things for acquisition. But we do use like acid-free tissue, acid-free boxes. Those kinds of precautions are taken as well.
Thanks, Jean. I think we have time for one more right there.
Yes, I have a question for her. You had talked about the corsets that the women were wearing. How in the world could they exercise with those things? And when did it become okay to take the corsets off entirely?
Well, a lot of corsets, I think, they weren't as tight laced as you see the most extreme examples. That being said, I'm sure they were very restrictive. But as you know, women wore compression garments well into the 40s and 50s. But of course, by that time, there were synthetics that made up that corset. Instead of lacing, you'd have latex or, lastex that would kind of keep everything in place. But as far as I understand, women played sports with those, probably a little less so in the 20s, but I think it came back until, it wasn't until the 60s that you're looking at more common use of single bras or and stuff like that to exercise. And so it's taken a long time, I think, to get there. Yeah.
Thanks for all the terrific questions, everyone. And just a reminder, if you are interested in the tour of our underground storage facility, you can meet up with Amanda right outside the exhibit gallery underneath the sign. And that gives me an opportunity to also invite you to visit the two exhibits that we have in the building. The Adger Cowan's photography exhibit is in the main gallery across the hall. And downstairs in the Bell Gallery, literally underneath us, is the Art of Travel narrative. And that's in the Bell Gallery. And the easiest way to get down there is to take the elevator at the bottom of the stairs down to the Wallen Center, and they will point you in the right direction. And we hope that you will join us again on December 2nd, online and in person, for a presentation by Margaret Ragnow, curator of the James Ford Bell Library. Food, glorious food, food and feasting in the pre-modern world. Thanks again for attending today, and you can see the presentations on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel in a few weeks. Thank you.